She thought she knew her husband, Robert, better than anyone. But on a Tuesday evening at Giovanni's, their favorite restaurant, the man she had spent half her life with dropped a bombshell that shattered everything. "I need space," Robert said, his voice cold and detached, like it was just another mundane decision to be made. There was no emotion in his words, no hint of the man she once knew. Margaret's heart sank as she realized that the man she loved for 2 decades was no longer the person sitting across from her. The timing couldn't have been worse. Margaret was battling stage 2 breast cancer, a diagnosis she had received only a few weeks earlier. But Robert wasn't there for her. Instead, he was distant, lost in his own world. Margaret had been holding on to the hope that their love and shared history would keep them together through this difficult time. But now it seemed like Robert had already checked out. 20 years isn't working anymore, he said, his words cold as he looked away, staring at the condensation on his glass. Margaret didn't ask for details. She didn't need to. She already knew. But there was one thing she hadn't expected. She hadn't expected what would happen next. Margaret had always been there for Robert. For 20 years, she supported his career, his dreams, and his ambitions. They had built a life together, one that looked perfect on the outside, but was crumbling beneath the surface. She gave up her own desires to help him climb the corporate ladder, managing their home, social obligations, and family life while he focused on his work. She had sacrificed her own career, put her dreams of starting a business on hold, and spent countless hours at charity events, dinners, and social gatherings. All the while, Robert's career flourished. His promotions, his rise through the firm, his long hours all became their shared goal. But as Robert's success grew, so did the distance between them. The signs had always been there. Robert's sudden obsession with his appearance, his new designer suits, the gym membership he actually started using, and the cologne that smelled foreign to Margaret, all of these were little clues that something was changing. Margaret had been too busy managing the life they had built to pay attention to the subtle shifts. She made excuses for him, telling herself that his long work hours were just a phase. She believed it was just the stress of his new position. She was wrong. Their conversations grew shorter, more superficial. His criticisms of her became sharper, and he spent more and more time on his phone, even during their rare dinners together. The once comforting moments they shared were replaced by awkward silences and disconnected glances. Margaret was still doing everything she had always done, but it wasn't enough anymore. She had noticed the changes, but she convinced herself that they could still fix things. After all, they had built a life together, hadn't they? But as she sat in her kitchen that night, after hearing the words "I need space," she realized something she couldn't ignore anymore. She wasn't the woman Robert had married. She had become a part of his life he could easily push aside. The discovery didn't come all at once. At first, it was small things: a missed dinner, a text message with a name that didn't make sense, and then the lipstick stain. Margaret had always prided herself on being observant, but when it came to Robert, she had turned a blind eye. She was too focused on managing her health, her treatment, and her role in their life to notice the growing distance between them. But the lipstick stain was impossible to ignore. It wasn't hers, and it wasn't a mark she had seen before. Margaret's heart sank and her stomach twisted. She remembered a time when Robert's cologne was something that could make her smile, but now it was a constant reminder that he had become a stranger. She didn't confront him immediately. She wasn't ready for that, not yet. But the clues kept adding up: the late-night calls he took in the garage, the expensive gifts he bought for Jessica, his secretary, and the way he flinched whenever she touched him. She had become a ghost in their home. It wasn't just the affair that hurt. It was the fact that Robert had stopped pretending. He had stopped pretending to care, to love her, and to care about their life together. Every day felt like a reminder that she was being left behind, that she wasn't part of the life they had built anymore. Then came the credit card statement. Margaret didn't need to look hard to find the evidence. There it was in black and white: charges for restaurants she had never heard of, jewelry stores, and vacations to places she had never visited. All of it pointed back to Robert and Jessica. The final blow came when Margaret finally asked, "Is there someone else?" Her voice was steady, though her heart was breaking. Robert's hesitation was all the answer she needed. "Jessica," he confessed, his voice barely a whisper. "It just happened." Just like that, he reduced their 20 years together to something that had just happened. No apologies, no remorse. Just a statement, as if their entire marriage had been a mere footnote in his pursuit of happiness with someone else. Margaret's world tilted on its axis. But she wasn't going to let Robert see how deeply his betrayal had wounded her. Not yet. Instead, she silently placed her napkin down, stood up, and walked out of Giovanni's. She was done. Her heart was broken, but her resolve was stronger than ever. The divorce papers arrived exactly 1 week after Margaret walked out of Giovanni's. Robert had wasted no time. The papers weren't even from his own law firm, they came from a divorce specialist he had hired. Everything was already decided. The home would be sold, their assets divided, and the personal property itemized with chilling precision. The process was sterile, businesslike, as if Robert were settling a routine transaction. Margaret sat at her kitchen counter, the envelope unopened for hours. Her fingers hovered over the seal as the weight of the decision and the finality of Robert's actions pressed down on her. She could feel her heart racing, the anger and hurt bubbling to the surface, but she refused to let it control her. Robert had thought he could take everything from her, including her dignity, but Margaret was no longer the woman who had stood silently by his side for years. She opened the envelope slowly, the coldness of the paperwork contrasting with the warmth of the memories she had once cherished. As she read the details, she felt a quiet sense of power growing inside her. Robert had tried to erase everything they had built together. But there was one thing he hadn't counted on, Margaret's strength. She didn't immediately call a lawyer. She didn't shout or cry. Instead, she signed the papers. She agreed to everything he wanted, without hesitation. But what Robert didn't know was that this was her strategy. She wasn't surrendering. She was biding her time, waiting for the right moment to strike. When she sent the signed papers back to his lawyer, she did so with the quiet knowledge that this wasn't the end. She was playing the long game. And in that moment, Margaret knew that her fight for justice was just beginning. "Are you sure about this?" her sister, Claire, asked over the phone after Margaret's decision to sign the papers. Margaret hesitated before answering. "It's not defeat, Claire. It's strategy. He thinks he's won, but he hasn't seen anything yet." As Margaret moved forward with the divorce, she felt the weight of her decision heavy on her shoulders. But little did she know, a twist was waiting for her, a twist that would change everything. 2 days after she had sent back the signed divorce papers, Margaret received a call from George Mitchell, her father-in-law. George had always been a quiet, dignified man, someone who had treated Margaret like a daughter since her own mother had passed away. They had shared many lunches together over the years, their talks filled with wisdom and compassion. "Margaret, I think it's time we had a talk," George said, his voice serious. "I've been meaning to tell you something for a while now, but I didn't know how." Margaret was taken aback. She had just started to process the pain of the divorce, and now George wanted to share something important. She sat down, her heart racing. Was he going to tell her something about Robert? When they met for lunch, George wasted no time. "I made a change to my will a few years ago," he said, looking directly at Margaret. "And I think you need to know about it." Margaret was stunned. George explained that he had added a clause to his will, a clause that Robert had never bothered to read. According to this clause, if Robert ever divorced Margaret without clear evidence of her infidelity, he would forfeit his entire inheritance. Everything. The family business, the lake house in Vermont, and a substantial estate, all of it would go to Margaret. "Why would you do that?" Margaret whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. George sighed deeply, his expression softening with regret. "I watched Robert take you for granted over the years. He never appreciated you the way he should have, and I knew that one day he'd throw you away for someone younger, someone more convenient for his career. I wanted to make sure that if he did, he'd lose everything. And it's not just for the money. It's because I believe you deserve better, Margaret. You deserve respect." Margaret sat back, processing this revelation. It felt like a sudden shift in her reality. She had been betrayed, yes, but now she realized that Robert's betrayal was not just a personal affront. It was part of a larger picture, one that had been carefully planned by someone who loved her. For the first time in a long while, Margaret felt a surge of strength. She wasn't just a woman who had been abandoned. She was someone with the power to change everything. And now, with George's will as her secret weapon, she was about to take back control of her life. Margaret's mind was made up. She had to act, and she would do it on her own terms. No more waiting, no more being the invisible wife. It was time to take control of her future, and Robert had no idea what was coming. As her radiation treatments continued, Margaret focused on regaining her physical strength. Each session, while draining, was a reminder that she was fighting for her life not just against cancer, but also against the betrayal that had turned her world upside down. Margaret spent hours planning her next move. She called on her closest allies, her sister Claire, her old mentor Judith, and even her former law firm. She started working on securing her financial future, hiring an advisor to help her navigate what would come next. But Margaret wasn't just surviving, she was rebuilding. One afternoon, while driving home from the hospital, Claire brought up something Margaret hadn't considered: her last name. "You've been Margaret Mitchell for 28 years, Claire said carefully, "but before that you were Margaret Jenkins. Why not go back to that name? It's yours, after all." Margaret paused, the idea settling into her mind. She had given up so much of herself over the years, but reclaiming her maiden name felt like reclaiming a piece of who she used to be: a woman with dreams and identity beyond Robert. The very next day, Margaret visited the courthouse. The paperwork felt empowering as she asked the clerk to restore her name. "Margaret Jenkins," the clerk said as she stamped the form. It wasn't just paperwork, it was Margaret's first act of defiance. With that, Margaret decided she was done hiding behind the shadows of her failed marriage. She wasn't just going to be a passive participant in her own life anymore. And then came the Instagram post. Margaret was scrolling through her feed when she saw it: Robert, his secretary Jessica, smiling at a table in an exclusive restaurant. A photo of the engagement ring with the caption, "We said yes." That ring, it was familiar. Margaret recognized it instantly. It had once belonged to her grandmother, a piece of jewelry Robert had always dismissed as outdated. But now Jessica was wearing it, proudly displaying it for the world to see. The engagement was fast, much faster than anyone expected after their divorce. Margaret felt a cold anger rising in her chest. But it wasn't just the engagement that hurt, it was the fact that Robert had moved on so quickly, trying to erase her from the picture completely. But Margaret had one more card to play. Robert didn't know it yet, but everything he thought he had secured was about to slip away from him. The moment had arrived. Margaret had spent weeks planning for this confrontation, and she was ready. She had never felt stronger, more in control. Her cancer treatments had ended, her finances were in order, and she had made peace with the life she was about to rebuild. But the final step required one last act of bravery, one last face-to-face meeting with Robert. The location was set: Lakeview Cottage, the family vacation home in Vermont. The very place where Robert had proposed to Margaret all those years ago. The place where they had once dreamed of a future together. It was fitting that it would be here where everything had started, that everything would end. As Margaret drove up the winding road toward the cottage, her thoughts weren't filled with anger or bitterness. No, this wasn't about that. It was about justice. About reclaiming the years she had lost, about standing tall in front of the man who had betrayed her, and about making sure he understood the full extent of what he had done. When Margaret arrived, Robert was already there, standing outside, looking a bit out of place in his business suit. He hadn't expected this. He had expected a quiet meeting to finalize the division of assets, maybe some awkward silence, and certainly no confrontation. But Margaret wasn't there to beg or plead. "I didn't expect you to show up," Robert said, his voice uncertain, as though the situation was already slipping from his grasp. Margaret walked up to him, holding the manila envelope that would change everything. "You didn't think I'd come, did you?" she said, her voice steady but filled with quiet power. "You thought you could leave me with nothing. But I'm not the woman you left behind anymore." Margaret handed him the envelope. Robert took it, confused, as he flipped it open. His eyes widened as he saw the contents: George Mitchell's will. The clause that Robert had never bothered to read was now in black and white. "I knew about the will," Margaret said, her gaze unwavering. "What you didn't know was that George foresaw everything. He knew what you'd do, and he made sure you'd lose everything if you ever treated me like this." Robert's face drained of color as he read the clause. His mouth opened in disbelief, but no words came out. "You thought you could erase me," Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger. "You thought you could walk away with your new life and leave me with nothing. But now, I hold the power, Robert. You never read the fine print, and now you'll pay the price for underestimating me." The silence between them stretched long, and in that moment Margaret knew she had won not just the battle for her inheritance, but the battle for her own self-worth. Robert's world, built on lies and betrayal, was crumbling before him. Margaret felt no joy in his discomfort, but she couldn't deny the satisfaction of seeing him face the consequences of his actions. She turned to leave, her heart full of quiet triumph. "I don't need your money, Robert. What I need is my freedom, and I'm finally getting it." Margaret left the cottage with her head held high. She wasn't the broken woman who had walked into that marriage all those years ago. She was stronger, wiser, and ready to reclaim her life. As she drove away, Margaret realized that she had done more than take revenge on Robert. She had freed herself from the past. She was no longer defined by him or their broken marriage. She was Margaret Lawson once more, and she was ready to start the next chapter of her life. Margaret's journey wasn't just about getting even with Robert. It was about finding her own strength in the face of betrayal. It was about reclaiming her identity and her future, when everything she thought she knew had been ripped away. The truth is, we all face moments in life when we're tested, when things seem impossible, when the people we trust the most let us down. But it's in those moments that we can choose to stand tall, to fight back, and to rebuild. Margaret's story is a reminder that, no matter how difficult the journey, we have the power to reclaim our lives, our dignity, and our happiness. Don't let anyone define your worth. And when you face betrayal, remember you can rise from it, stronger than before. If you've ever been betrayed or felt like you've lost everything, remember Margaret's story. The fight isn't always about getting revenge, it's about getting your life back. Like, share, and comment if you believe in second chances. Remember, your story is yours.